All you had was the body and the markings on the body.
In Los Angeles, a serial killer known as the Hillside Strangler turned out to be a pair of sadists.
A certain chemistry develops between them that emboldens both of them together.
Detectives had almost no clues to help them.
In that kind of situation, you're hoping for the worst. Another victim for evidence.
We didn't come up with one fingerprint, not a fingerprint, not from anybody.
But after a dozen deaths, the murderers became careless, and prosecutors were able to jail two of America's most deranged killers.
The people in this neighborhood are shocked and they are frightened.
It was a killing spree that horrified the citizens of Los Angeles.
This victim is number 10 in a series of mysteriously similar incidents.
Over 4 months at the end of 1977 and at the beginning of 1978, 10 young women were murdered.
Investigators are no closer today to apprehending the killer than they were 6 weeks ago.
From the start of the investigation, detectives found striking similarities between the cases.
Generally, the bodies were found in the hills surrounding the city of Los Angeles, pretty close to the center of the city. They were all sexually abused.
The cause of death was ligature strangulation. On October the 31st, 1977, the alarm was raised in a neighborhood north of downtown LA.
We received a call 5:36 a.m. in which we were told there was a young female, possibly a teenager, that was found dead in La Crescenta, which is above Glendale. She was nude, and at that point they thought it possibly could have been a drug overdose.
The owner of a nearby house had covered the victim with a tarpaulin. When detectives uncovered the body, they were startled by what they found.
She had ligature marks on her ankles, marks on her wrists, and a mark around her neck.
They concluded that this was no drug overdose.
This was murder. Only thing that was on that body was a small tuft of fiber, and it was on her right eyelid, and it was no bigger around than the tip of your finger.
Investigators believed that the fiber could have come from the tarpaulin, so they asked the homeowner what he used it for.
And he used it in the backyard to cover his kids' toys. And amongst those toys were some white stuffed animals.
So the forensic lab tested everything at the scene, including the toys.
We eliminated everything that was in the backyard.
Finding no matches for the white fluff on the victim's eyelid, the detectives thought it might be a vital clue.
Where that fiber came from, why was it there? We didn't know.
There was little other evidence. It took police 10 days to identify the victim, Judy Miller.
She was a 15-year-old runaway. She lived on the streets in Hollywood.
This diner near Sunset Boulevard was the last place Judy had been seen. But even before she was identified, another victim was found. Her name, Lisa Castin.
And she was found, 8-10 miles away. She had been dumped on the side of a road. She was found nude, and she had been strangled.
At the morgue, investigators examined the bodies of Judy and Lisa. The ligature marks were the same.
They were identical. So at that point, we knew we were looking for one or more individuals that was responsible for both of these murders.
More bodies turned up during November 1977. 5 bodies were found in 1 week, including those of the 2 youngest victims, Sonia Johnson, age 12, and Dolores Cepeda, 14.
They're very close. They used to like to shop together a lot, and this particular day they were shopping at the Eagle Rock Plaza.
Police believe the girls were grabbed on their way home from a shopping trip.
That sort of threw everything over the edge. The media went crazy.
Because the bodies had been dumped in the hills around LA, the press named the killer the Hillside Strangler. By mid-November 1977, the bodies of 5 girls and young women had been found in the Los Angeles area. All the victims had bruises that suggested that they had been tied up, and they had all been strangled with a ligature before their bodies were dumped in the hills around LA. The police knew they were after a serial killer, dubbed by the media the Hillside Strangler.
One after another, their nude, strangled bodies were found dumped along various Los Angeles hillsides.
It's very frightening.
He's sick. That's all. It's just insane.
The bodies were piling up, and we had no results to show for it. Makes the job pretty tough.
The 6th victim was found on November the 20th.
I noted puncture marks in her arm.
At first, police thought she was a hype, someone who injects heroin.
She also had some needle marks in her neck, which could have sustained the fact that she was a hype, but that was eliminated very quickly when we identified her and found out who she really was.
She was 20-year-old Christina Weckler, a student at the Pasadena Art Center College of Design. 9 days later, the Hillside Strangler struck again.
The body of the latest victim, 18-year-old Lauren Wagner, was found sprawling across a sidewalk.
Her father identified the body.
She was on her way home about 10 o'clock. Neighbors saw her taken from her automobile right in front of 2 doors down from our house.
The neighbor provided crucial new evidence. There were 2 men in the car.
That confirmed our belief from the beginning that there were 2 bad guys. Some of the areas were not accessible for just one person to lay a dead body in without some help from somebody.
Because there seemed to be evidence that there was more than one person, it seemed as if there were what we call team killers at work. A certain chemistry develops between them that emboldens both of them together.
And on this occasion, the killers had left important clues.
She also had burn marks on her hands that did not look like they were from a cigarette. It was quite obvious that this poor girl was a victim of torture.
There was also a sticky substance on her fingers.
The residual stickiness on her fingers later became a very, very important factor in this case, in that fibers stuck to that residual matter on her hands.
Fibers that could have come from the original crime scene.
Finding the location where the individuals were murdered, it carries a lot more information than finding the location where the bodies were dropped after death.
We're starting at a place where a body's been placed, so the lack of evidence is obvious. There isn't any.
At the height of the investigation, a special task force was set up in the LA police headquarters. They fielded over 11,000 tip-offs.
And all of those required an individual investigation. We didn't have a computer system. Everything was done in longhand, and it was hard to control.
And there was something else that hindered investigators.
There was no trauma to these bodies other than the ligature marks. There was no evidence that any force had been used on them.
What it tells me and what it tells investigators is that the initial contact between the victim and the perpetrator was one of authority.
We actually investigated a number of Los Angeles policemen.
So this further terrorized women. They were arming themselves. They were afraid of being stopped by police officers for traffic infractions, thinking that might be the Hillside Strangler.
Media scrutiny was intense, and the police were under a lot of pressure to solve the case.
The pressure from above, the political pressure, the pressure from police department. Do this, do that, do this, do this. We got to get on this case.
For the 93 policemen working full-time on the case, it's been full-time frustration. 7,000 leads tracked down, most leading nowhere.
Many, many composites were out there. Many, many composites. People who said, so-and-so's a Hillside Strangler, or so-and-so lives here and he's the Hillside Strangler. Composite drawings are really never closed.
In almost all the crimes, there was little physical evidence.
In most of them, all you had was the body and the markings on the body, the ligature marks.
The victims were all under 30 and had a variety of backgrounds.
Although the very first victim that we didn't connect right away, Yolanda Washington, was in fact a working prostitute.
Killing street prostitutes doesn't really attract a lot of attention from the media. I mean, it happens every day.
They're looking for someone who is easy to grab. They're not going to be seen doing it. It's easy for them to overpower, and they're just looking for more of an opportunity than they are a particular type of victim.
The ninth victim, Kimberly Diane Martin, was also a prostitute. On December the 13th, 1977, one of the killers called her from this payphone at the Hollywood Public Library. He told her to come to an empty flat in a building on Tamarind Place. The police believed that she was injured there, but not killed.
They did something to her in that building, and she had some kind of a skull fracture or bruising that indicated she'd been hit.
About 6:30 this morning, a couple of paper boys on their route here discovered the body and immediately called the police. It appears that it is the work of the so-called hillside strangler.
But in this attack, one of the killers left a vital clue.
The Martin case, they had a fingerprint off the phone booth where the call went into the outcall service.
The police later learned that the killer's fingerprints were already on file. Some people believed the fingerprint evidence should have cracked the case.
Unfortunately, at that time, the national database of fingerprints had not yet been established. We have a system now, the integrated automated fingerprint identification system, links databases from around the country. And so finding a latent print at a crime scene could certainly lead very rapidly to the identity of the source.
After Kimberly Martin's body was found, there were no new hillside strangler cases for 2 months, until a car was found in the Angeles National Forest on February the 17th, 1978.
About 9:45 this morning, a fire department helicopter was doing a flyby of the area. They saw a vehicle over the side. They in turn notified our Crescenta Valley Sheriff Station. When they looked inside the trunk, they found the body of a female.
Detectives recognized the killer's methodology. 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth was the last victim in Los Angeles of the Hillside Strangler.
One thing we knew, at least I felt, the killers were still out there somewhere. It's just a matter of a point where. They just weren't in LA, because serial killers generally just don't stop.
11 months later, in January 1979, the case of the Hillside Strangler was reopened.
The big break in the case was the phone call from Bellingham, Washington. They wanted to run a background on a guy they had in custody, Kenneth Bianchi, that was suspected of a double murder. And he had a driver's license that put him in Los Angeles.
Bellingham police suspected that Bianchi, a 27-year-old security guard, had murdered 2 young women, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder.
The coroner's report indicated that both had died of strangulation caused by a ligature. The girls were assaulted in some manner sexually.
They believed Bianchi had lured the 22-year-old Karen to an empty house where she was to house sit while the owners were away. She brought along her roommate, Diane Wilder.
He took Karen Mandick into the house by herself, had her go down the stairs in front of him, and murdered her on the staircase. We believe he then moved the body aside and went and got Diane and had her precede him down the staircase, where he ligature strangled her as well.
Police later found their bodies in Karen's car, parked in a secluded spot.
The bodies were removed and put on sterile sheets, and that was a fortuitous thing because one of the items that fell off one of the bodies onto one of those sterile sheets was a pubic hair, which later turned out to be a hair of Kenneth Bianchi.
The physical evidence was overwhelming on both of those murders.
One of the girls did tell her boyfriend what was going to happen, and there was also a note left behind. So when the girls became missing, the police already had a tip as to who they were hooked up with, that it was Kenneth Bianchi.
Detectives began building the case against him for the double murder in Bellingham. Meanwhile, 2,000 kilometers away in Los Angeles, investigators were looking into Bianchi as a suspect in the Hillside Strangler case. They were stunned at what they found. Bianchi had once lived next door to Christina Weckler and across the street from Cindy Hudspeth.
We had somebody that was connected somehow to the victims. So we knew going in, we had a righteous suspect.
To their dismay, they also found that the Hillside Strangler Task Force already had Bianchi's name on file.
It should have been solved by one of the clues that was called in to LAPD, because the mother of a girl that Bianchi dated didn't like him. And when all the stuff was coming out about what was going on, she just had this just gut feeling. So she called the task force and says, "You ought to look at Kenneth Bianchi."
Bianchi had also applied to be an LAPD reservist and had gone on ride-alongs with the police.
He asked the ride-along officer questions about the Hillside Strangler killings.
Wanted to go see the crime scenes where they were.
The LA detectives flew to Bellingham, where they examined the remains of the Washington State victims.
They examined the two bodies carefully and compared the ligatures with photos they had of some of the other Los Angeles victims, and were pretty certain that Bianchi was indeed the Hillside Strangler.
But if Bianchi was the Hillside Strangler, who was his partner in crime? Police got the answer from Bianchi's girlfriend, Kelly Boyd.
What she knew about him, the closest person to Bianchi was his cousin, Angelo Bono.
Facing 12 murder charges, Ken Bianchi claimed insanity. This is the videotape of his psychiatric examination.
Probably the easiest thing for a killer or serial killer to malinger or feign is what was once called multiple personality disorder. Pretended to go under hypnosis and to come out with a persona named Steve Walker.
Which was the biggest BS of this whole case.
Hi. Hi. Are you Ken? Do I look like Ken?
Because Bianchi, played it. I mean, played it to the hilt. Really did.
Pardon me. It isn't Ken, is it? No, it's not. It's Steve.
And then implicated Angelo. Angelo Bono, his cousin.
I killed her. Angelo killed her. They mean the Wagner one Angelo killed. This broad I'd never seen before. Martin. This broad I'd never seen before. Hudspeth, you never saw them at all? No.
That's a hint. And try to slide out from under it yourself. And so I think in that case we see that Bianchi was the slick, manipulative one of the two.
This broad I killed. These two Angelo killed.
But specialists were able to prove that Bianchi didn't have a multiple personality. He had been faking the symptoms.
Shortly after that, he decided to plead guilty and cooperate in the murders down in Los Angeles.
In the autumn of 1979, detectives finally got a chance to question Bianchi about the LA murders.
Are you ready to talk about Thomas Bianchi? Yes, I am.
And I remember one of the first things this idiot said to me when I went up there. He says, "I'm now in a position I've always wanted to be in, Sergeant Grogan. I want to be a detective, and I'm going to help you with this case."
Detectives subjected Bianchi to intensive questioning. They thought they could crack the Hillside Strangler case.
He wouldn't sit there and give you word by word, blow by blow description of everything that he and Angelo did. He kind of scatterbrained it around a little bit. But in telling us what he did tell us, he firmed our belief that this is the guy. Because some of the information that we received from him was information only the murderer would have known.
With suspected Hillside Strangler Ken Bianchi behind bars in Washington State, Los Angeles detectives began to zero in on Angelo Bono, the man they believed was Bianchi's partner in crime.
We have to do a protective surveillance because we got a guy that's been identifying the killing of 10 girls, and God help us if he kills one while we're putting our case together. He was very, very street smart, relatively very stupid, intellectually a zero, but street con very smart.
At the same time, detectives conducted extensive interviews in Glendale, Bono's hometown. The information gleaned helped to build the case against Bono. They even talked to his school teachers
We did everything we could to find who, what, when, where, and how about Mr. Bono. We found out that Angelo Bono was a sexual predator.
Investigators learned that although Bono had attended school, he barely learned to read or write.
This is a kid that was oversexed, always making overtures to the girls. He was a sexual predator from early on, from very early on.
Bono quit school at 16. He got in trouble with the law and was arrested for stealing cars. He spent a short time in juvenile detention. But while Angelo Bono was under surveillance and a suspect in the case, there was as yet no evidence to link him to the Hillside Strangler killings. In the autumn of 1979, Ken Bianchi was in custody, the prime suspect in the Hillside Strangler cases in Los Angeles, as well as 2 killings in Washington state. LA police had concluded that 2 people had worked together to commit 10 murders in 4 months. And they had reason to believe that Bianchi's cousin, Angelo Bono, was the accomplice. By the time he was 35, Bono had had a succession of girlfriends and wives. He had fathered 8 children in and out of wedlock. He was also a sexual sadist.
He brutalized his wife, who was married to many years, and frequently tied her up to have sex with her. Interesting enough, he tied her up by the ankles and by the wrist.
But despite his limited education, he made a good living doing upholstery work on cars. In 1975, Bono went into business for himself with the purchase of his dream house. Located at 703 East Colorado Street in Glendale, it had a small garage in the back that he turned into Angelo's trim shop.
He did one of Frank Sinatra's cars. He did a car belonging to one of the Supremes. He usually had some Rolls-Royce type cars or limousines around that he was doing.
And he also used the house for something else: murder.
After spending a lot of time talking to Mr. Bianchi, the crime scene was pointedly identified to us as Angelo Bono's house.
That's where everything occurred. That's where, once they abducted the females from the street, that they took them to the workshop, they took them to the house, and that's where they were sexually assaulted, and that's where they were murdered.
While Bono was under surveillance in LA, investigators from Bellingham were checking out Ken Bianchi, who was originally from Rochester in New York State.
We sent a team to Rochester immediately following Bianchi's arrest to conduct a background investigation and find out what we could about him.
They learned that his mother had been a young prostitute who had given Ken up at birth. He was later adopted by Angelo Bono's Aunt Frances and her husband, Nicholas Bianchi, but he didn't give his adoptive parents an easy time.
He had a bad temper, so he was just simply not doing well as a child. He suffered, undoubtedly.
And things only got worse for Bianchi in high school.
He was someone who had a reputation for not telling the truth and couldn't seem to find his slot in a normal environment.
The police even investigated Bianchi as a suspect in a string of unsolved cases in Rochester. They were called the Alphabet Murders because the 3 young victims all had names with the same first and last initials.
They're still unsolved, and Bianchi was in the area at the time.
He would have been a teenager in 1971 and 1973 when the girls were sexually assaulted and strangled. Their bodies were found in towns that started with the same letters as their names.
I believe in a couple of those cases there was evidence that indicated they might have recently had milkshakes, and Bianchi worked as a soda jerk in a pharmacy, and at least one of the young women disappeared between her home and that pharmacy.
But there was no evidence to prove anything.
Investigators learned that after graduating from high school, Bianchi tried to become a policeman. But when he was turned down, he became the next best thing, a security guard.
And I think that the original idea of becoming a security officer or a policeman was his way of dealing with his tremendous feelings of inadequacy. As a police officer, he had power. As we came to understand him in these crimes, it was important for him to feel powerful.
Being a security guard also gave him the opportunity to steal. Although he was never arrested for theft, he did change jobs frequently.
He just was going nowhere, and it was at that point that his mother contacted Angelo Bono in LA and said, "Could my son come and stay with you?"
In January of 1976, Ken Bianchi moved in with Angelo at 703 East Colorado Street.
Personally, they didn't get along. They had a lot of fights. But Kenny shared in, when the young girls were staying at the house, Kenny shared in that activity.
Ken managed to find a job in downtown LA and moved out of Angelo's house in July 1976. But he didn't go far. His flat was just a few hundred meters from Angelo's house at 809 East Garfield Avenue. That New Year's Eve, he began to date Kelly Boyd, who was originally from Bellingham, Washington. When Kelly became pregnant 5 months later, the couple moved to 1950 Tamarind Place in Hollywood. It was at this time that the cousins, Ken and Angelo, started to act on their shared violent perversions.
He had two girls that he abducted who stayed in his house that he sexually abused for many, many months, and used them in the alleged prostitution game. He was going to become a pimp.
They kind of tried out the idea that they trusted one another and they could break the law and get away with it and be successful as...
On the night of October the 17th, Bono and Bianchi were cruising Hollywood Boulevard when they picked up a 19-year-old prostitute, Yolanda Washington.
I am convinced that Bono drove the car, Bianchi got out of the car and did a very credible job of pretending to be a detective-type undercover officer, presented a badge and convinced her she was under arrest, and put handcuffs on her and put her into the car.
They then drove north on the Hollywood freeway.
Eventually, in the back seat, Bianchi killed her. It was probably seat of the pants on that first murder.
But that first murder is going to tell the tale in a way. If they get away with it and it was something that empowered them or excited them or made them feel alive, the chances are pretty good that they will do it again and then again.
They developed their methodology with their second victim, the 15-year-old runaway Judy Miller.
As the cases come along, there's a little more planning. There's a little more sitting down and discussing what we're going to do.
After picking up Judy on the street, they drove her back to Angelo's house, where they tied her up by the legs and wrists. Then they blindfolded her and put her in a chair while they figured out what they were going to do next.
As Bianchi put it, who was going to go first, who was going to go second, whether they were going to flip a coin.
In Angelo's spare bedroom, they raped and strangled Judy, perfecting the method they would use on their later victims.
The ligature mark in the neck was used for strangling with a rope. It was also used to tie bags over their head. They used plastic bags to try to induce suffocation.
I believe Bono did almost all of the sex, and that Bianchi did all, if not most, of the strangulation, and that it was done simultaneously, and they both got their thrill out of the way they did that, and it served each of their own purposes.
Victim number 3, 21-year-old Lisa Castin, was neither a prostitute nor a runaway. She was a waitress at a health food restaurant. With Lisa's murder, the killers became even more daring, abducting her close to her home. On November the 6th, her body was found near the Chevy Chase Country Club in Glendale.
The way Bianchi told it, there were days when they said, "Hey, Angelo, you want to go out?" And Angelo said, "Yeah, let's go out." And that was it. They'd get in the car and go.
By the beginning of November 1977, the Hillside Strangler serial killing team of Angelo Bono and Ken Bianchi had already murdered 3 young women.
And they'll do it more often, more brutal, take more risks, until eventually they just either die, stop, or get caught.
The 2 young schoolgirls, Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Johnson, had been missing for almost a week when their bodies were found in a rubbish dump on November the 20th.
It was determined that they were in the custody of Bono and Bianchi at Bono's residence for probably 3 or 4 days, based on the time that they were reported missing and on the time that their bodies were found. So I'm sure they went through hell with the game playing of Mr. Bianchi and Mr. Bono.
But when Detective Sergeant Grogan later tried to question Bianchi about these murders, he clammed up.
It was one subject matter that he cared not to address. He was very embarrassed to discuss the death of 2 young girls. It bothered him.
By now, 5 bodies had been found.
There were so many in a fairly short period of time that it indicated this is more of entertainment or a game. In that case, you're going to find a certain amount of experimentation.
Christina Weckler's murder at the hands of Bianchi and Bono was particularly gruesome. The cousins tried to kill her by injecting cleaning fluid into her arm and neck. When that failed, they used gas.
Team killers play off of each other, and they develop sort of a killing chemistry where this is what they do together.
On November the 19th, Angelo and Ken abducted Christina from her home. They got her out of the house by telling her that someone had crashed into her car. But unlike the other victims, Christina was not a complete stranger. Ken Bianchi had lived next door to her at 809 East Garfield Avenue.
She had met him on a previous occasion and actually had made a notation about him in her date book that she kept. Thought he was a real phony.
He was not a very careful serial killer. Most of them target absolute strangers.
Victim number 7, 28-year-old Jane King, was a complete stranger.
Jane was an aspiring actress type, very, very beautiful girl.
One night in November 1977, Jane had just left LA's Scientology Center, where she was taking acting classes. Investigators learned that the cousins lured Jane into a car and took her to Angelo's house. There, they sexually abused and strangled her. It was the 7th murder, and the police were desperate for clues.
In that kind of situation, you're hoping for the worst. Another victim for evidence. I mean, that's the worst thing you'd think of, but you do that. You can't help doing that. You say, well, if there's another case, maybe we'll have a bigger break.
Their break came with the next case, the murder of Lauren Wagner. Investigators later found out that Buono and Bianchi had attempted to electrocute her, taping electrical wires to her hands. But the tape they used caught the fiber investigators later found on her body. Now, with Bianchi cooperating with detectives, it wouldn't be long before they had something to match it to. But although he was talking, Bianchi still wasn't telling them everything.
There was never any specific information from Bianchi to say, step 1 was this, step 2 was this, step 3 was this. Nothing really specific as to say who did exactly what to whom.
But in the 9th murder, detectives found another link between Bianchi and a victim.
He had lived on Tamarin, which connected him to the Martin case.
Kimberly Martin was the prostitute that Bianchi and Buono had lured to an empty flat at 1950 Tamarin Place. It was the same building where Ken lived with his girlfriend, Kelly.
And then also a prints in the phone booth at the Hollywood Library where the phone call was made to get Kimberly Martin to come to that apartment building.
And that fingerprint matched him, by the way. After we got back from Bellingham, we had them compared.
Investigators also discovered a link between Bianchi and the 10th victim, Cindy Hudspeth, whose body was discovered in her car at the bottom of a cliff. Her flat at 800 East Garfield was on the same street where Bianchi once lived.
There's no indication that they ever knew each other before that, but he did live across the street from her.
Detectives learned that Cindy went to Angelo's workshop on February the 16th, 1978, to get new floor mats for her car. Ken showed up unexpectedly.
And Bono had this beautiful, reddish-haired young girl there and was talking to her. And during that conversation, Bono and Bianchi, decide, let's do her. They ended up sexually assaulting her and killing her.
There would be no more hillside strangler cases in Los Angeles. After their 10th murder, Angelo Buono decided to call it quits.
Kenny was getting out of control, and probably in the way they were approaching women or whatever. We know that on the day of the last murder, they tried to abduct another woman, and they botched that.
They had a breakup. Bono told him, get out of his life. I'm going to kill you.
By now, Bianchi's girlfriend, Kelly Boyd, had given birth to their son and had moved to Bellingham, Washington, to be near her family. Ken decided to join her there.
When he was on his own, he still wanted to kill. He hadn't satiated that need, but he also couldn't pull it off by himself.
Bono was much more clever and probably able to control things better than Bianchi. I mean, Bianchi does a double murder in Bellingham, Washington, and he's caught almost immediately.
Bianchi was clearly a killer. Maybe he wouldn't have killed as much without Bono, but the probability is that Bono wouldn't have been a killer without Bianchi.
In October 1979, Ken Bianchi pleaded guilty to the double murder in Bellingham and to 5 of the 10 killings in Los Angeles. The guilty plea would keep him from the electric chair.
We saw remorse from Ken Bianchi. He loved to cry.
Your Honor, I can't find the words to express the sorrow I feel for what I've done. In no way can I take away the pain that I've given to others.
But as soon as he walked out of court, he's laughing and joking around, you know, it's just faking. He faked remorse because the psychopath's very good at looking around, seeing what emotions are appropriate and mimicking them.
As part of his plea agreement, Ken promised to testify in court against his cousin, Angelo Bono. With Ken Bianchi pleading guilty to 7 counts of murder, the LA police needed to build a case against the man they suspected was his accomplice in the Hillside Strangler cases, Ken's cousin, Angelo Bono. For several months, the LAPD had Bono under surveillance in Glendale. In October 1979, it was finally time to pay him a visit.
We gotta go see him. We have to get some statements from him on the record.
So Bob Grogan and another detective went to his workshop. They showed him photographs of the victims.
And his response basically was, yeah, I saw a picture in the paper. Yeah, I saw her picture in the paper. And it just kind of ticked me off, like I was showing him pictures of baseball players. I mean, no reaction, no reaction.
We served a search warrant at 703 Colorado, which was Angelo's residence and workshop.
They found the house and workshop well kept and clean.
It was so clean, as a matter of fact, that when we processed it chemically for fingerprints, we didn't come up with one fingerprint, not a fingerprint. Not from Angelo Bono, not from anybody, which was highly unusual.
Although there were no fingerprints in Angelo Bono's house from either Bono or his victims, other physical evidence found there implicated him in the crimes.
Now the fiber evidence becomes extremely important.
The victims were placed in a chair in the living room.
We came up with a series of fibers from inside the chair where you normally lose your coins if you sat down, and it matched the fibers that were recovered from the palm of the hand on the Wagner murder.
And they also matched the fluff on Judy Miller's eyelid to some upholstery material in Angelo's workshop.
We found out why it was on the eye, which was something we didn't know, and that was because it was used as a blindfold.
On October the 19th, the police arrested Angelo Bono. He was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder.
I don't remember him saying a significant word with 0.
His trial began on November the 16th, 1981, and lasted 2 years and 2 days. It was one of the longest murder trials in American history.
It was like trying 10 separate murder cases, so it was like doing one trial after another.
And star witness Ken Bianchi still had some surprises up his sleeve when prosecutor Michael Nash began his questioning.
And I asked him if he had committed these murders.
And his first answer was, as you might expect, I don't know.
It went downhill from there. It went from I don't know Maybe I remember bits and pieces.
But a lot of times he'd just go with the flow and say, we did this and we did that.
During the 6 months that Ken was on the stand, he and Angelo barely exchanged glances. Bono mostly just stared into space.
Angelo Bono was really void of any demonstration of emotion. I think some of the press who wrote about him described him almost as reptilian.
Throughout the proceedings, Angelo Bono maintained his innocence.
Our defense was he didn't do it. Kenneth Bianchi was the killer, and he made a deal to save his life by implicating his cousin.
But in the end, the jury wasn't convinced.
He was convicted of 9 out of the 10 murders.
The only murder he was acquitted of was the first one.
We did a pretty strong job of showing that if they did one, they had to have done them all, except for on Yolanda, Washington, because that one doesn't fall in the strict MO of all the others.
During the penalty phase of the trial, the jury decided to spare Angelo's life.
I think jurors, from what we heard, felt that both defendants were equally culpable and that if one got life, the other one should too.
On January the 9th, 1984, Judge Ronald George formally sentenced Angelo Bono and Ken Bianchi to life. Bono died of natural causes in September 2002. He was 67.
I was in Canada at the time, as a matter of fact, and I got a call. My reaction was that the death penalty finally, was served out in the state of California. It just took a long time.
Under the terms of his plea agreement, Ken Bianchi received life sentences in Washington state and in California. While in prison, Bianchi has protested his innocence.
Now I think he's saying he's totally innocent and we framed him. Yeah, that's the character you're dealing with.
These were some of the worst criminals that I've ever seen because there was nothing about the heat of passion. There was no diminished mental capacity or insanity. They killed because of the momentary sexual gratification of raping and then killing their victims.
And I always felt such sympathy and empathy for the parents and the survivors that they would, the rest of their life, deal with this stuff that these two animals perpetrated on them. It's incredible. Incredible.